Her name was Claire Donovan, and she carried herself with the quiet poise of someone who had seen the world at its harshest and yet chosen to remain gentle. Once, she had been a sergeant in the United States Army, the kind of leader who stayed at the back of the line to ensure everyone else made it through first. Now, years later, her medals were tucked away in a box no one asked about, and her wheelchair had become the silent witness to her resilience. Claire lived in a modest apartment on the edge of town, where sunlight spilled gently across faded curtains each morning. On her windowsill, small plants grew in mismatched clay pots, tiny green victories that she nurtured with patient hands. Life after service was never what she imagined. The war had left its marks, some visible, others too deep for the eye to catch. And yet, in her quiet way, she found a rhythm, wheeling herself to the community center for gatherings, attending veteran support groups, or simply sitting by the park to watch the wind move through the trees. But even in these ordinary moments, a distance always remained. Strangers often looked at her chair before her face. Some smiled politely. Others avoided eye contact altogether. Claire had grown used to both reactions, but deep down she longed for the days when people saw the soldier first and not the wheels beneath her. She hadn't always been this way, confined, as some would call it. Years earlier, her body had been stronger, her strides steady under the weight of body armor. Afghanistan had tested her endurance in ways no training could have prepared her for. Blistering heat that clung to her skin, nights where the silence felt heavier than gunfire, mornings that smelled of dust and diesel. She had led patrols where every corner felt like a question mark, every shadow a possibility of loss. And yet, she remembered those days with a strange tenderness. Her platoon had been her family, laughing over canned rations, sharing water bottles, carving jokes into the edge of fear. They had seen her as one of them, not as a woman to be shielded, but as a soldier who could carry her own. That respect had meant everything. Then came the roadside explosion, the blast that ended her career in an instant. She never forgot the sound, a shattering crack followed by silence that seemed to swallow the world. When she woke in the hospital, her legs unresponsive, the truth had settled like ash in her lungs. The war had taken her stride, but it had not broken her will. The years since were marked not by dramatic triumphs, but by small, stubborn victories. Learning to navigate a kitchen again. Finding strength in her arms that her legs could no longer provide. Teaching herself that dignity wasn't lost in the shift from standing tall to sitting still. Yet, in the quiet, there were also nights when she wept into her pillow, mourning the woman who once ran 5 miles before dawn and who now measured distance in ramps and doorways. Despite it all, Claire's spirit never hardened. If anything, she softened. She listened longer when neighbors spoke. She noticed details others missed. The weariness in a cashier's voice, the tremor in an old man's hand. Pain had made her tender, and in that tenderness, there was an unshakable strength. At the community center, where she often went to play cards with fellow veterans, she was known not for her chair, but for her smile. She laughed easily, though her laughter carried undertones of loss, and when new veterans arrived, fresh from deployments, she welcomed them with warmth that said, "You are not alone." Still, the world outside the community was not always kind. There were moments in public, small, cutting ones, that reminded her of her difference. The hurried driver who parked in the accessible spot without thinking. The whispered comments she overheard from teenagers passing by. The impatience of strangers when her pace slowed a crowded aisle. They were not gunfire or explosions, but these moments struck her all the same. Small wounds layered over old scars. Claire endured them quietly. Yet her silence did not come from weakness. It came from choice. She had fought battles that demanded her voice and her fury. Now, in civilian life, she often chose to let cruelty pass unchallenged, not because she couldn't fight, but because she knew where her strength was better placed. There were days, though, when the weight of it pressed harder. She would roll past her old photographs, herself in uniform, flanked by her squad, and feel a pang of dissonance. Was she still that soldier? Or had the chair rewritten her entirely? The answer, she reminded herself, was both. The woman in the pictures had been fierce and unyielding, The woman in the chair was steady and compassionate. They were not opposites. They were continuations. One evening, sitting by her window, she let the sound of passing cars fade into the background and closed her eyes. She thought of the desert winds, the laughter of her comrades, the call to prayer echoing from distant hills. She remembered the taste of dust, the grip of her rifle, the weight of responsibility in her chest. All of it was still hers, carried quietly within her. And so, when the world saw only a wheelchair, Claire knew better. She was not defined by what had been taken from her. She was defined by what she still carried: loyalty, resilience, and a courage that no blast could extinguish. The beginning of her story was not in the chair. It was in the choice she made every morning to rise in her own way and live with dignity. The afternoon sun was soft that day, filtering through thin clouds and laying pale ribbons of light across the sidewalks. Claire wheeled herself down the familiar stretch of town that led to the small cafe she sometimes visited after her community center gatherings. It wasn't far, just 2 blocks, but each journey into the world beyond her apartment carried its own weight. The cafe sat on a corner where traffic slowed to a crawl and pedestrians spilled across crosswalks. Its glass windows were always fogged with the scent of roasted beans and warm bread. Claire liked to sit by the window, where she could watch life move by at its unhurried pace. But before she reached the doorway that day, she heard the laughter. At first, she thought nothing of it. Laughter often floated through streets, careless, fleeting, harmless. But this laughter was sharp, the kind that cut rather than lifted. 3 young men leaned against the brick wall of a convenience store nearby, their eyes following her with an intensity that prickled her skin. "Hey, look at Wheels over there," one of them muttered, his voice carrying easily in the open air. Another smirked, tossing a crumpled can into the gutter. "Bet she drives faster than traffic." Their laughter rose again, crude and unrestrained. Claire felt the words like gravel beneath her hands, rough and stinging. She kept her gaze steady on the cafe door ahead, her palms firm against the rims of her wheels. She had learned long ago not to let strangers dictate her worth. Still, the sting lingered, a quiet ache beneath her ribs. The men didn't stop. Their voices grew louder, carried by the false bravado of youth. "Hey, soldier girl, salute us," one called out, mockingly raising 2 fingers to his brow. Another mimicked the motion of pushing a wheelchair, jerking his arms dramatically while his friends laughed harder. Claire's hands trembled on the rims. She slowed her movement, not because she couldn't go faster, but because her heart needed steadiness. The air around her seemed to tighten, filled with the weight of attention she never wanted. A small crowd had begun to notice, people passing by with quick glances, some disapproving, others hesitant, none stepping forward. Inside, she felt the clash of 2 selves, the soldier who once barked commands under fire unflinching, and the woman who now lived in the fragile quiet of civilian life. For a moment, the soldier stirred, her pulse sharpening, her breath steadying for confrontation. But she held it back. Violence was never her language of choice, and cruelty did not deserve the dignity of her rage. Instead, she looked up at them, not with anger, but with a gaze that was steady, unflinching, and quiet. It was the same look she had given frightened recruits overseas, the kind that said, "I see you, and you cannot shake me." Her silence unnerved them for a moment, their laughter faltering in the face of her composure. Yet silence, though powerful, was also heavy. Claire turned toward the cafe door, lifting her hand to push it open. The glass reflected her face back at her, calm but pale, her jaw clenched in restraint. She reminded herself she had faced worse. She reminded herself she had already survived the unthinkable. Still, beneath her composure, the ache remained. Each word they had thrown stuck like burrs, reminders that the world outside her small circle could still be cruel. She wheeled to her table by the window, her body upright but her spirit pressed under the memory. As she sipped her coffee, the voices replayed in her head. "Wheels. Soldier girl. Salute us." They weren't the worst words she had ever heard. But they carried something more insidious, a dismissal of who she was, an erasure of her dignity. And perhaps that was the hardest wound of all, not the blast that had taken her legs, but the ignorance of those who couldn't see beyond it. She let her hands rest on the warm cup, the steam soft against her skin. Closing her eyes, she pictured the desert again, the rhythmic crunch of boots on gravel, the rustle of canvas tents in the wind, the quiet nods exchanged between comrades. Out there, respect was survival. Each life mattered. Each role was vital. No one mocked a soldier's strength, not if they understood the cost. The cafe door chimed again, breaking her reverie. A man entered, broad-shouldered, his presence quiet but commanding. His gaze swept the room before landing briefly on her. He nodded once, a small gesture of recognition that carried more weight than the words outside ever could. Claire returned the nod, subtle but certain. She didn't know his story, only that the rhythm of his movement, the cut of his posture, spoke of service. And in that brief exchange, she felt anchored again. For every voice that mocked, there were others who understood. Others who carried unseen scars, others who would not let her stand alone. Her strength did not come from silencing the cruel. It came from remembering who she was despite them. It came from the quiet, stubborn choice to continue rolling forward, to claim her place in a world that sometimes stumbled in its humanity. When she left the cafe, the young men were gone. The air was calmer, the street bathed in the golden edge of sunset. Claire wheeled herself home with slow, deliberate motions, the rims cool beneath her hands. Each push forward felt like defiance, not against them, but against the weight they had tried to place on her spirit. And though the sting lingered, so too did the memory of that simple nod, the unspoken solidarity of another soul who knew. It reminded her that struggle was not the end of her story. It was the terrain she moved through, steady, unyielding, still carrying the heart of a soldier within her. The evening had begun to settle across the town, folding the streets into long shadows and streaks of amber light. Claire moved steadily down the sidewalk, her hands guiding the rims of her chair with practiced rhythm. She was tired, though she would never admit it aloud, the kind of tired that came not only from the body but from the weight of being seen and misjudged all at once. As she reached the corner near the convenience store, she noticed them again. The same three young men, lingering with the restless energy of people who had nothing to do but find someone else to diminish. Their voices floated toward her, jagged and careless. "There she is again," one muttered, a sharp grin tugging at his mouth. The others snickered. Claire's pulse tightened, though her face remained composed. She had hoped the cafe encounter would be the last of them, but life often placed trials in repeating patterns, as if testing whether her resolve would hold. She steadied herself, refusing to let them see the flicker of unease beneath her calm. Her fingers pressed firmly into the rims, the metal cool against her palms. She would pass, she told herself. She would pass, and let them dissolve into their own noise. But one of them stepped forward, his sneakers scuffing the pavement. "What's the rush, Wheels? Thought you'd salute us this time." His voice carried a mocking cheer. Claire lifted her chin slightly, her silence speaking louder than any word she could give. Yet silence could also make cruelty bolder. The second young man joined in, circling slightly closer, his laughter exaggerated. The third tapped the back of her chair lightly with his foot, a gesture meant to belittle, to remind her of what they believed she lacked. Claire's breath drew in slow, steady. She had been through deserts that burned her skin, through nights when artillery cracked the sky apart, through mornings where the line between life and death blurred into dust. This was not fear, it was insult. But insult carried its own kind of pain, the kind that left bruises on the spirit. She thought, fleetingly, of her comrades, of the way they had always stood shoulder to shoulder, never leaving one another exposed. And for a heartbeat, loneliness pressed against her chest like a weight too heavy to bear. Then a voice cut through the air, low but firm. "That's enough." The sound came from behind her, steady as a stone dropped into water. The young men turned, their bravado pausing at the sight of him. A man approached from across the street, tall and broad-shouldered, his stride purposeful. He wasn't loud. He didn't need to be. The set of his jaw, the calm focus in his eyes, the deliberate way he moved, all of it spoke a language they recognized but did not understand. Claire recognized it, though. She had seen that posture before, in desert heat and in briefing tents. It was the bearing of someone trained not just to stand but to shield. The tallest of the bullies laughed, though the sound wavered. "What? You her bodyguard now?" The man didn't answer immediately. He closed the space between them, his presence grounding the air. When he finally spoke, his voice was even, measured, almost quiet, yet it carried the weight of command. "You'll step back. Now." There was no threat in his tone, no raised volume, only certainty. It was the kind of certainty that made defiance feel foolish. The three exchanged glances, their earlier arrogance faltering beneath the gaze of someone who clearly lived in a world beyond theirs. One muttered something under his breath and backed away. The others followed, their laughter now hollow, their steps retreating down the block. Within moments, the noise of them dissolved into the hum of evening traffic. Claire exhaled, a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. She turned slightly, her eyes meeting the man's. He nodded once, a gesture simple but filled with recognition. "Ma'am," he said softly, as though acknowledging not just her presence but her story, her service, her dignity. Her throat tightened, but she managed a small smile. "Thank you." His gaze lingered, steady yet kind. "No one disrespects a soldier in my sight," he replied. His words were not loud, but they carried the unshakable rhythm of truth. For a moment, silence settled between them, but it wasn't heavy. It was steady, grounding. She saw in his eyes the familiarity of someone who had known service, who had known the same costs. There was no pity there, only respect, as even and unyielding as stone. When he left, he did so without flourish, his steps purposeful but unhurried, fading into the evening light. He didn't need thanks. He hadn't come for recognition. He had come because it was right, and because solidarity among those who carried scars, visible or not, was never optional. Claire watched him go, her chest full with something difficult to name. Relief, yes. Gratitude, certainly. But beyond that, a quiet reminder that she was never as alone as the world sometimes made her feel. Somewhere, unseen until needed, there were still those who would stand beside her. She wheeled forward again, her movements smooth, deliberate. The street seemed softer now, the air less heavy. The sting of insult had not vanished, but it no longer pressed so sharply. It had been met, countered, and dissolved by the strength of another. Later that night, as she sat by her window, she let the memory return, the mockery, the sting, the voice that had broken through it. She thought of how easily cruelty had filled the silence of the crowd, and how one calm voice had been enough to end it. Her reflection in the glass looked back at her, steady and unbroken. She whispered softly, almost to herself, still standing. And, in her heart, she felt it was true. The night air drifted gently through Claire's window, carrying with it the muted hum of the town, distant engines, the occasional bark of a dog, the soft hush of leaves brushing against one another. She sat quietly, her chair angled toward the glass, watching how the moonlight painted silver across the street. The world seemed softer in those hours, as if it exhaled after the weight of the day. She let her hands rest in her lap, fingers curled lightly, the skin marked by years of strain and perseverance. The memory of the confrontation lingered, not in sharp edges now, but in echoes. The taunts no longer stung as they had. They had been washed clean by the steady presence of the man who had intervened. A Navy SEAL, she had realized from his bearing, his calm authority, his refusal to let cruelty stand unchecked. It had been only a moment, brief, almost ordinary in its simplicity. And yet, that moment shifted something deep inside her. For so long, she had carried the weight of believing that the world saw only her chair, her difference, her vulnerability. But his voice had cut through, affirming what she had always hoped. She was still seen as who she was, not just what life had left her with. The following morning, she rolled into the community center earlier than usual. The room smelled faintly of coffee and old wood, the kind of familiar scent that settled the heart. Veterans gathered in small clusters, voices low, hands gesturing as they shared stories that civilians might never understand. Claire's presence was greeted with nods, smiles, and the kind of acknowledgement that carried no pity, only camaraderie. She joined a table near the back, where an older Marine was teaching a younger veteran how to play dominoes. The pieces clacked gently against the surface, a rhythm of play and patience. Claire watched for a while, smiling, before one of them gestured for her to join. As the game unfolded, laughter bubbled easily between them. Not the sharp, mocking laughter she had endured the day before, but the kind that warmed the air, layered with understanding. Each story shared around that table was a reminder. They had all carried burdens, all endured losses, and all found ways to keep moving forward. For Claire, the contrast was striking. On one side of the world, cruelty existed, small, senseless, unthinking. But here, in the company of those who knew, there was a gentleness, a respect that restored her faith. It reminded her that even if the world faltered, there were always spaces where dignity was honored. That evening, she returned home with a lighter heart. She wheeled herself to her bookshelf, where a small wooden box sat tucked on the middle shelf. She opened it carefully, her fingers brushing against the metals she had kept hidden for years. They were cool against her skin, each one carrying the weight of days when she had stood not just for herself, but for her comrades, her country, and the fragile hope of peace. For a long time, she had avoided looking at them. They reminded her of what she had lost, of the body that no longer moved as it once had. But now, as she held them, she felt something shift. They weren't just symbols of the past. They were testaments, proof that she had lived through storms and returned, changed but unbroken. She set one of the medals on her windowsill beside the plants, letting the moonlight catch its surface. For the first time, it didn't feel like a relic of who she used to be. It felt like a reminder of who she still was. Days passed, and Claire found herself reflecting often on the man who had stepped forward. She didn't know his name, and perhaps she never would. But the memory of his voice, calm and unwavering, became something she carried like a talisman. It wasn't about him as a person, it was about what he represented. The truth that dignity can be defended, that solidarity still lived quietly in the hearts of strangers. She thought often of how small moments could alter the course of a spirit. One cruel laugh could bruise deeply. One act of respect could heal just as strongly. Life was built in these moments, she realized, not in grand gestures, but in the steady weaving of compassion and recognition. One late afternoon, she returned to the park where she often watched the wind dance through the trees. The sky was wide and painted with the gold of sunset. Families passed with children in tow, couples walked hand in hand, and she sat quietly at the edge of the path, breathing in the stillness. A boy wandered close, no older than 8, his sneakers scuffing the pavement. He stopped when he saw her chair, curiosity bright in his eyes. Instead of looking away, he smiled. "Cool wheels," he said simply, before dashing back to his family. Claire laughed softly, the sound carrying into the open air. There had been no mockery in his words, only innocent admiration. And in that moment, she realized the world wasn't tilted only toward cruelty. It held light too, small and unguarded, ready to meet her if she kept herself open to it. That night, she closed her eyes and let herself rest without the weight of yesterday pressing on her chest. She whispered to herself, as she sometimes did, words that anchored her spirit. "You are still a soldier. You are still whole." And with that, she let the quiet wrap around her like a blanket, knowing tomorrow would bring its own trials, its own gifts, and that she would meet them as she always had, steady, resilient, and unbroken. For she was more than the chair, more than the scars, more than the silence of strangers. She was a testament to survival, a living reminder that even in the face of cruelty, dignity endures. And in that truth, Claire found not just strength, but peace. Morning light spilled across Claire's apartment in soft, golden layers. It caught the edges of her windowsill plants, making the small leaves glow with a fragile kind of courage. She sat by the window, a mug of tea warming her palms, listening to the distant stir of the town as it woke. Somewhere a church bell rang, steady and sure, and for a moment she let herself breathe in its rhythm. The events of the past week lingered, their edges worn smooth by time, but not forgotten. The laughter of the bullies, the quiet authority of the man who had stepped forward, the boy in the park who called her wheels cool, each moment left a mark. Some cut, some healed. Together, they had become a tapestry of reminders of how fragile dignity could feel, and yet how easily it could also be restored. Claire traced the rim of her cup slowly, her fingers moving in absent circles. She thought about resilience, not the loud, battle-cry kind that the world admired, but the quiet endurance that looked like waking up each day and choosing, again, to live with grace. That kind of resilience wasn't celebrated in medals or parades. It existed in the silence of kitchens, in the stillness of lonely nights, in the small acts of refusing to give up. Later that morning, she wheeled herself toward the community center. The streets were damp from a light rain, the air rich with the scent of wet pavement and blooming lilacs from a nearby garden. Drops clung to her tires, leaving faint trails behind her as she moved. Inside, the center buzzed with the low hum of conversation. A new face greeted her at the door, a young woman, maybe in her 20s, her shoulders hunched with the invisible weight of fresh memories. Claire recognized that look immediately. She had seen it in the mirror after her own return home. The young veteran's uniform was gone, but the war still clung to her posture. Claire offered a gentle smile. "First time here?" The woman nodded, her voice small.
"Yeah.
"Just trying to figure things out." "Then you're in the right place," Claire said, guiding her toward a circle of chairs. "None of us have it figured out completely, but we help each other carry the weight." The young woman's shoulders eased slightly, and for Claire, the moment felt like a quiet turning of the wheel. Once, she had been the one searching for a place to land. Now, she had become part of the ground that others could step onto. As the group gathered, stories wove through the room, some spoken, some left in silence, but understood all the same. Claire listened as an older veteran shared memories of his brother who hadn't come home, as another described the struggle of returning to work when his body no longer obeyed as it once did. When her turn came, she didn't tell them about the bullies or even about the seal who had stood for her. Instead, she spoke of mornings by the window, of tending her plants, of the way resilience sometimes meant choosing stillness over noise. Her words were quiet, but they carried. The young woman beside her wiped a tear and whispered, "Thank you." That evening, Claire rolled back through the park. The setting sun stretched long golden fingers across the grass, children's laughter rising like music around her. She found her favorite bench, the one near the pond where ducks often glided in lazy circles. She sat in silence, letting the colors of the sky seep into her heart. Across the path, she noticed a figure sitting alone on another bench, a man with broad shoulders, posture still and calm. Her breath caught slightly as recognition stirred. It was him, the one who had intervened. For a moment she considered staying where she was, letting the memory remain as it was. But something within her urged her forward. She wheeled across the path, the gravel crunching softly beneath her tires, and stopped a short distance away. He turned at the sound, his expression softening into a nod. "Evening," he said simply. "Evening," she replied, her voice steady though her chest carried a strange warmth. They didn't speak long. They didn't need to. He asked if she was doing all right, and she told him she was. She thanked him again, though he brushed it aside gently, saying only, "We look out for each other. Always have, always will." The sun dipped lower, painting the pond in hues of fire and gold. They sat in companionable silence, two soldiers from different branches, different battles, bound by a thread only those who had served could truly understand. When Claire returned home that night, she felt lighter. Not because the struggles had vanished, they would always remain, woven into the fabric of her life, but because she no longer felt she bore them alone. The world could wound, yes, but it could also heal. And sometimes, healing arrived in the form of strangers who refused to look away, who stepped forward, who reminded her that her strength was seen. She placed her chair near the window, gazing out at the silver glow of the moon. Her medal still sat on the sill, catching the faint light. She touched it gently, not as a relic, but as a living part of herself. "Tomorrow," she whispered into the quiet, "I'll rise again." And she knew she would. Not because life was easy, but because she had learned the quiet art of endurance, the steady, unbroken will to keep moving forward. For in her heart, Claire was still the soldier who carried others, still the woman who nurtured green life on her windowsill, still the veteran who faced the world not with bitterness, but with grace. And that, she realized, was her greatest victory of all.